Most people don't realize how much mental space money takes up until they stop for a moment and actually pay attention. It's not always loud. It's not always panic. Most of the time it's quiet. It shows up in the background of your thoughts, like a low-level hum you've gotten so used to that you barely notice it anymore. You wake up and check your phone. You go through your day. You do what you're supposed to do. And somewhere underneath all of that, there's this constant awareness of money. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a everything is falling apart way. Just enough to keep you slightly tense. You might not even label it as stress. You might call it being responsible, being realistic, being careful, but it's there. It's there when you hesitate before opening your bank app. It's there when you think twice before spending, even on things you've already justified. It's there when a bill hits, even if you can pay it. And it's there when money comes in too. That's the part that confuses people the most. Because you'd think earning more would make this feeling go away. You'd think once you reached a certain level, a certain number, your mind would finally relax. That you'd stop thinking about money so much and just live. But for a lot of people that never happens. They earn more, and instead of peace they feel pressure. Pressure to maintain. Pressure to not mess it up. Pressure to make sure this isn't the peak. And so the mind stays alert. Always scanning. Always calculating. Always bracing for something. This is what most people live with every day. And they don't even realize it's optional. They assume this is just what adulthood feels like. That this is what being good with money looks like. Quiet worry. Constant awareness. Never fully at ease. And if you're listening to this, there's a good chance you recognize that feeling. You might not be broke. You might not be struggling in a visible way. But money still has a grip on your attention. It influences your decisions more than you want it to. It shapes your sense of safety. It affects how free you feel. And what's strange is that from the outside, everything might look fine. You have a job. You pay your bills. You might even be doing better than you used to. But internally, there's still this sense that you're one wrong move away from things tightening up again. One unexpected expense. One slow month. One bad decision. And your body knows it. You feel it in the way you tense up when you think about the future. In the way you plan for worst-case scenarios automatically. In the way you feel relief when money comes in. And anxiety when it slows down. This is the part nobody really prepares you for. Because growing up, you're taught that if you work hard and do the right things, money will take care of itself. That stress comes from not trying hard enough or not being disciplined enough. So when the stress doesn't go away, even as you try harder, you start to internalize it. You tell yourself you should be more grateful. You tell yourself other people have it worse. You tell yourself to stop complaining. And so you keep going. You keep pushing. You keep managing. You keep holding it together. But the tension stays. And over time that tension becomes normal. You don't question it anymore. You just build your life around it. You choose safer options. You delay things you actually want. You stay in situations longer than you should. Not because you don't want more, but because uncertainty feels heavier than dissatisfaction. And that's the part most people never say out loud. It's not that you're afraid of failure. It's that you're afraid of instability. You're afraid of things slipping. Of losing ground. Of having to start over. So you become very good at surviving. Very good at managing. Very good at making things work. But not necessarily at feeling secure. And when you see other people talk about money with confidence or ease, it creates this quiet comparison. You wonder how they're so calm. You wonder what they know that you don't. You wonder why money seems to weigh on you differently. And sometimes, without meaning to, you turn that into a judgment about yourself. Maybe you think you're just wired this way. Maybe you think you're too cautious. Or not cautious enough. But here's what I want you to hear, clearly and without judgment. This quiet financial anxiety is not a personal flaw. It's not a sign that you're bad with money. It's not proof that you're irresponsible. And it's definitely not something that means you're failing. It's a learned state. A pattern your mind adopted because at some point, being alert around money made sense. And once a pattern like that forms, it doesn't disappear just because your income changes. That's why this feeling can follow people from their first paycheck all the way into financial success. That's why some people never feel settled, no matter how much they earn. And that's why, if this feels familiar, it's not because you're doing something wrong. It's because your mind is trying to protect you, using rules that were written long before your current reality. And this is where the story actually begins. Because once you start noticing this background tension, once you start seeing it not as just how things are, but as something that developed over time, you're no longer just reacting to money. You're becoming aware of the role it plays inside you. And awareness is the first shift. In the next part, we're going to look at where this pattern comes from, and why working harder often makes it worse, not better. You don't have a money problem. That statement alone usually creates resistance. Because on the surface it feels obviously false. Bills are real. Numbers are real. Counts are real. Shortfalls are real. But if money were the problem, then information would have fixed it by now. And it hasn't. Most people listening to this already know what they're supposed to do. Budget better. Spend less. Invest earlier. Save consistently. Increase income. Avoid debt. The instructions are not hidden. They're repeated endlessly. Yet knowing them doesn't change behavior. Changes intentions. Briefly. Until life applies pressure. And the same patterns return. That's the first fracture in the logic. Because if logic were actually in control of money decisions, repetition wouldn't happen. Awareness would be enough. Insight would stick. The fact that it doesn't tells us something uncomfortable. Something else is deciding. And whatever that is, it doesn't respond to spreadsheets, advice, or willpower. This is where most people misdiagnose themselves. They assume the issue is discipline, or motivation, or self-control, or confidence, or income. They label themselves irresponsible, impulsive, lazy, bad with money. These explanations feel personal, even moral, and that's why they persist. But those labels don't explain consistency. Because patterns require a system. Randomness doesn't repeat with precision. Yet financial behavior does. The same overspending at the same emotional moments. The same avoidance at the same thresholds. The same collapse right after progress. The same ceiling that never quite breaks. That isn't chaos. That's obedience. Most people aren't failing at money. They're following rules they don't know exist. And those rules don't live in the mind. They live somewhere deeper. Somewhere that doesn't speak in language. Somewhere that learned long before numbers ever mattered. Which raises a question most people never ask. When did your body first learn what money meant? Not what you think about it now. Not what you say you believe. But what it came to represent emotionally. Because money is never just money. For some people it's safety. For others it's conflict. For others it's approval. Or power. Or shame. Or threat. Or love that disappears. Or attention that only arrives when it's gone. Those meanings weren't chosen. They were absorbed. Before adulthood. Before logic. Before choice. Childhood doesn't teach through explanation. Teaches through repetition and emotion. Through tone. Through tension in the room. Through what happens right before or after money appears. Through who becomes quiet. Who becomes angry. Who becomes afraid. Who becomes controlling. Who becomes unavailable. A child doesn't understand interest rates. But they understand stress. They understand silence. They understand raised voices and slammed doors and long pauses at the kitchen table. They understand whether money brings closeness or distance, safety or threat. And the nervous system records all of it. Not as memories but as rules. Rules like don't have too much or someone gets upset. Don't want more or you're selfish. Don't relax because something bad is coming. Don't succeed too visibly or you'll be judged. Don't fail either or you'll be ashamed. None of these rules sound like thoughts. They sound like feelings, urges, hesitations, tightness, avoidance, sudden impulses that feel irrational only after they've already happened. That's why money decisions feel logical in hindsight but emotional in the moment. Because logic isn't leading. It's narrating. The decision is made before the explanation appears. This is why people can intellectually understand what to do and still do the opposite. Why advice works temporarily, then evaporates under stress. Why progress feels exciting right up until it feels dangerous. Why success creates anxiety instead of relief. Because the system in charge doesn't care about growth. Cares about safety. And safety to the nervous system is defined by the past, not by the future, which creates a collision most people never see. The version of you that wants financial freedom is future-oriented. Thinks in goals, possibilities, expansion. But the version of you that actually controls behavior is past-oriented. Thinks in threat, belonging, survival. When those two versions disagree, the older one wins. Every time. That's when self-sabotage appears. Not as a flaw, but as protection. Procrastination isn't laziness. It's hesitation disguised as apathy. Overspending isn't irresponsibility. It's regulation. Under-earning isn't lack of ambition. It's invisibility. Seen this way, the behavior suddenly makes sense. And that's unsettling. Because if these patterns are serving a purpose, then removing them isn't as simple as trying harder. Willpower becomes irrelevant. Motivation becomes cosmetic. Discipline collapses the moment it threatens emotional safety. This is the point where many people feel relief, and then fear. Relief because they're not broken. Fear because if this is true, then the problem is much deeper than they thought. And it is. Because these systems aren't just personal. They're reinforced. By families. By culture. By stories of scarcity, struggle, virtue, and worth. By praise for sacrifice. By suspicion of ease. By unspoken contracts that say, stay like us. Don't outgrow us. Don't leave. Money becomes the battleground for loyalty. Outgrowing financial limits can feel like betrayal. Earning more can feel like abandonment. Stability can feel unfamiliar. Ease can feel unsafe. So the system intervenes. Not loudly, quietly, with doubt, with distraction, with urgency, with justification, with perfectly reasonable explanations for why now isn't the time. Why this opportunity isn't right. Why it's better to wait. Why something feels off even when nothing is wrong. And when you obey, the nervous system relaxes. That relief becomes the reward, which means the pattern strengthens. This is how ceilings persist for decades. This is how people repeat instead of fail. This is how children inherit emotional money scripts without a single conversation ever happening. And this is only the surface level. Because even recognizing these patterns doesn't break them. Awareness doesn't rewire a system designed for survival. Insight doesn't override conditioning formed before language. Seeing the cage doesn't open the door. That's the tension most people sit with once they truly understand this. The enemy is no longer vague. It's no longer external. It's no longer the economy or bad luck or not enough information. It's an internal control system optimized for a past that no longer exists. And it's still in charge. Which leaves you in a suspended state. More aware than before. Less comfortable with old explanations. Unable to unsee the patterns. But not yet free from them. That discomfort is not a problem. It's a signal. Because once you see how deeply money is tied to identity, safety, and belonging, once you recognize that logic was never meant to lead, you can't go back to thinking this was just about numbers. And the deeper you look, the more layers appear. Something shifts when people stop asking, what should I do? And start asking, why do I keep doing this? That question doesn't come from logic. Comes from exhaustion. Comes after trying harder. After promising yourself, this time will be different. After making progress. And watching it quietly unravel in familiar ways. And for a long time the assumption is simple. It must be me. Bad with money. Inconsistent. Impulsive. Undisciplined. Good intentions, weak follow-through. That identity settles in slowly. Not all at once. It builds through small moments of disappointment. Through watching other people seem to handle money with ease while you feel like you're constantly correcting, fixing, catching up. Until one day, the story feels true. But then something strange happens. You notice that your behavior isn't random. You notice that you don't overspend all the time, only in specific emotional states. You notice that you don't procrastinate everywhere, only where money is involved. You notice that confidence shows up in other areas of your life, but disappears the moment finances enter the room. That's usually the first crack. Because inconsistency across contexts suggests something important. This isn't a character flaw. If it were laziness, it would show up everywhere. If it were irresponsibility, it wouldn't be selective. If it were a lack of intelligence, it wouldn't coexist with competence elsewhere. Which leads to a quieter realization. What if this isn't about who I am, but what I learned? That question alone changes the tone. And this is where stories start to matter more than concepts. Because once people hear examples that mirror their own experience, skepticism doesn't argue, it recognizes. Like the person who grew up watching money create tension in the house. Not dramatic explosions, just constant tightness. Bills opened in silence. Conversations cut short. A background hum of worry that never fully went away. As an adult, they make decent money. Enough at least. But no matter how much comes in, the feeling never leaves. There's always urgency. Always a sense that something bad is about to happen. So they spend, not recklessly but quickly. As if money burns holes when it stays still. Relief comes not from saving but from release. They always thought they were bad at planning. But the pattern wasn't about planning. It was about escaping a feeling they learned early on. Money equals pressure. Or the person who grew up being praised for sacrifice. For being low maintenance. For not wanting much. For being grateful. As an adult, wanting more triggers guilt. Charging appropriately feels selfish. Raising prices feels uncomfortable. Earning more creates internal resistance, not because they don't want it, but because it violates a deeply ingrained rule. Don't need too much. They always told themselves they lacked ambition. But ambition was never the problem. The problem was loyalty. Or the person who watched a parent lose everything. Business collapse. Layoff. Financial betrayal. Something sudden, destabilizing, unforgettable. As an adult, this person is careful. Too careful. Opportunities feel risky even when they're sound. Growth feels exciting until it feels dangerous. So they stall. They hesitate. They wait for certainty that never comes. They call it being cautious. But what's actually happening is protection. And when people hear these stories, something inside them exhales. Because they recognize themselves. Not in the details but in the logic of the pattern. That's when the thought appears, often quietly. Maybe I wasn't bad with money. Maybe I was trained. That realization doesn't hit like excitement. Hits like relief. Not the kind that makes you celebrate. The kind that makes your shoulders drop. Because shame needs choice to survive. And conditioning removes choice. This is where belief starts to replace skepticism. Not belief in a method. Belief in a reframe. People begin to see their past behavior differently. Not as evidence of failure, but as evidence of learning. And once you see that, you start noticing moments that never made sense before. Like why money conversations feel charged even when nothing is wrong. Why checking accounts triggers anxiety disproportionate to the numbers. Why earning more doesn't automatically feel safer. Why success sometimes brings discomfort instead of peace. These aren't mysteries anymore. They're signals. Signals that money isn't operating as a tool. It's operating as a trigger. And triggers aren't negotiated with logic. They're responded to by the nervous system. This is where the pressure eases. Not because the problem is solved, but because it's finally named accurately. People stop fighting themselves. They stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What happened that made this feel necessary?" That shift alone changes everything. Because self-sabotage looks very different when you realize it's not trying to destroy you. It's trying to protect you from something it believes is dangerous. Overspending becomes understandable. Avoidance becomes intelligible. Ceilings become contextual. And with that understanding comes credibility. Not because the explanation is clever, but because it matches lived experience. People start replaying their own history through this lens. Childhood moments resurface. Emotional patterns click into place. Conversations from years ago suddenly make sense. They remember who handled money, who feared it, who controlled it, who argued about it, who went silent around it. And they see the line connecting then to now. That's the turning point. Because once someone reaches the conclusion themselves, I wasn't bad with money, I was programmed, you don't need to convince them anymore. The resistance dissolves. But this is also where a new, quieter tension begins. Because relief doesn't mean resolution. Understanding the origin doesn't undo the impact. Knowing why you react doesn't stop the reaction. And people begin to notice something unsettling. Even with this awareness, the patterns still exist. They can see them more clearly now, predict them sooner, name them faster, but they still feel real. The urge still arises. The hesitation still appears. The discomfort still signals. Which leads to the next realization, less relieving, more sobering. If this was learned without choice, it probably can't be unlearned with willpower. And that thought lingers, 'cause it implies depth. It implies that money behavior isn't a habit you tweak. It's a system you interrupt. And systems don't collapse just because they're understood. This is where the act subtly pivots again. The audience is no longer skeptical. They're no longer defensive. They're no longer blaming themselves. But they're not free either. They're aware enough to feel the edges of something larger. Something layered. Something that didn't start with them, and won't end with them unless it's addressed differently. The relief is real, but it's incomplete. And that incompleteness is intentional. Because this act isn't here to solve the problem. It's here to prove the problem is real, patterned, and shared. It's here to replace shame with clarity. It's here to earn trust, not by promising answers, but by finally asking the right questions. And as the pressure begins to rise again, one final truth becomes unavoidable. If money behavior is driven by subconscious systems, and those systems were shaped by emotion, identity, and survival, then changing outcomes will require going deeper than strategy. Much deeper. And whatever lives down there, whatever rules are still running quietly in the background, once people accept that money behavior is conditioned rather than chosen, a new question inevitably surfaces. If this is true, then what exactly is running the system? Not metaphorically, not philosophically, but mechanically, because conditioning doesn't operate randomly. Follows rules, predictable ones, psychological ones, laws that apply whether you understand them or not. And the first law most people never see is this. Identity comes before income. Not income as in skill. Income as in what feels allowed. Every human nervous system carries an internal definition of someone like me. That definition includes unspoken limits. How visible you're allowed to be, how comfortable you're allowed to feel, how much stability is safe, how much attention is tolerable. Money doesn't challenge logic first. Challenges identity. That's why people can increase their income briefly and then mysteriously lose it. Or raise their prices and feel immediate internal pushback. Or approach a new financial level and suddenly experience doubt, fatigue, distraction, or chaos. The system isn't asking, can you earn this? It's asking, who would you become if you kept it? There's a difference between wanting more money and feeling safe as the person who has it. Consider someone who grew up as the responsible one, the fixer, the steady one. Their identity is built around control and reliability. Chaos gave them purpose. Struggle made them useful. As an adult, financial instability feels familiar, even grounding. But ease threatens the role. Without struggle, who are they? So money rises. And something happens. They overcommit. They help others financially at their own expense. They create urgency where none exists. Stability slips, not because they don't know how to maintain it, but because it destabilizes who they believe they are. Income didn't exceed ability. It exceeded identity. Which brings us to the second law, quietly shaping financial behavior. Loss aversion is stronger than desire. Humans are not wired to pursue gain. They are wired to avoid loss. And the nervous system defines loss far more broadly than money leaving an account. Loss includes emotional safety, belonging, familiar roles, predictability, approval, which means that when financial growth threatens to remove something emotionally familiar, even something painful, the system resists. This is why people sabotage success more reliably than failure. Failure is familiar. Success is unknown. Think of someone who grew up in scarcity, where every dollar mattered and mistakes were costly. As an adult, abundance feels surreal, temporary, almost suspicious. So instead of enjoying it, they brace for impact. They assume it will disappear. And to regain a sense of control, they unconsciously accelerate the loss. They spend it. They give it away. They make impulsive decisions. Not because they don't value money, but because losing it on their own terms feels safer than waiting for it to be taken. Loss aversion doesn't ask, "What do you want?" It asks, "What are you trying not to feel again?" And often what people are avoiding has nothing to do with money at all. This leads directly into another misunderstood law. Scarcity and abundance are nervous system states, not financial states. Two people can have the same income. One feels calm. The other feels constant pressure. Because scarcity isn't about how much you have. It's about how threatened you feel. A nervous system trained in scarcity interprets neutral events as warning signs. A slightly lower month feels catastrophic. A delayed payment feels personal. A dip feels like the beginning of the end. So behavior tightens. Focus narrows. Creativity collapses. Short-term decisions replace long-term thinking. This is why scarcity perpetuates itself. Not because of numbers but because of perception. And abundance isn't the presence of money. It's the absence of threat. Which is why giving someone more money without addressing their conditioning rarely changes how they experience it. The internal environment remains unchanged, so the external resource gets filtered through the same lens. This is also why affirmations fail. You cannot think your way into abundance if your body is still scanning for danger. Which brings us to one of the most important reveals in this entire act. Money decisions are emotional decisions made at the speed of feeling, not thought. The story people tell themselves is that they evaluate options, weigh pros and cons, and choose rationally. What actually happens is faster. Emotion signals first. The nervous system chooses. Logic explains afterward. That explanation feels convincing because it's coherent. But coherence isn't causation. This is why people confidently justify decisions that clearly don't serve them. The explanation isn't lying, it's just late. For example, someone might say, "I spent that money because I deserved it." But what actually happened was emotional depletion, fatigue, a need for relief. Or, "I didn't invest because it didn't feel right." What actually happened was fear disguised as intuition. Without awareness, emotion wears the mask of reason. And this isn't a flaw. It's biology. The nervous system evolved to keep you alive, not wealthy. Prioritizes immediate safety over future reward. Which explains another pattern most people never question. Time and money are perceived differently under emotional pressure. In calm states, people can delay gratification. They can plan. They can invest. They can wait. Under threat, time collapses. The future shrinks. Only the present matters. This is why stressed people make expensive decisions. Why urgency costs money. Why panic leads to poor timing. The system isn't stupid, it's protective. It doesn't ask what's optimal. It asks, what ends this feeling fastest? And money becomes the tool for emotional regulation. Spending soothes. Avoiding delays discomfort. Earning validates. Saving calms. Until it doesn't. Because regulation through money is temporary. Which leads to the deeper realization forming now. Most financial behavior isn't about wealth creation. It's about emotional management. And once people see that, They start recognizing how often money is used to solve problems it was never meant to address. Loneliness, insecurity, overwhelm, fear of judgment, fear of being left behind. Money becomes symbolic, charged, heavy, and strategies alone can't neutralize that charge. This is where authority is earned, not by claiming answers, but by revealing structure. The audience begins to see that their patterns aren't unique, but lawful, predictable, reproducible. Identity sets the ceiling. Loss aversion enforces it. Scarcity distorts perception. Emotion initiates action. Time collapses under threat. These aren't opinions. They're operating principles. And the more clearly they're seen, the harder it becomes to pretend money was ever just about math. At this point, something important happens internally. People stop asking, "What should I do differently?" and start asking, "What would have to change inside for different behavior to even be possible?" That question marks the beginning of rewiring, not the completion, because understanding laws doesn't exempt you from them. Knowing gravity exists doesn't let you float, but it does let you stop blaming yourself for falling. And that's the shift underway now. The audience feels smarter, not intellectually but structurally. They're no longer chasing tactics blindly. They're seeing the architecture beneath their experience. And yet, there's still tension, because these laws don't dissolve on contact. They persist. They continue operating quietly, efficiently, automatically. Which means the real work, the disruptive work, hasn't been done yet. But now it's finally clear where it must happen. Not at the level of advice. Not at the level of motivation. Not even at the level of belief. But at the level where identity, safety, and survival intersect. And if that feels unsettling, because transformation doesn't begin with comfort. Begins with accuracy. And what you're seeing now, these laws, these patterns, this internal machinery. This isn't the solution. This is the map. At a certain point, information stops being useful. Not because it's wrong, but because it's no longer what's needed. Understanding can only take you so far before something else has to happen. Something quieter. Something internal. Something that doesn't feel like learning at all. Feels more like remembering. Because up until now, everything you've seen has been externalized. Patterns, systems, laws, conditioning, structures that explain why things have unfolded the way they have. But now the focus turns inward. Not to fix, not to improve, but to recognize. There is a version of you that has been carrying this entire story. A version that learned early how to survive, how to adapt, how to stay safe, how to belong. That version made decisions long before money ever entered the picture. Money just became the language those decisions spoke through. So before anything changes, that version deserves to be seen. Not judged, not corrected. Because the old identity you've been trying to outgrow was never wrong. It was necessary. It learned what worked in the environment it was born into. It learned when to stay quiet, when to hold back, when to push, when to retreat, when wanting more was dangerous, when having less was safer. It learned rules that kept you intact. And it did its job well. That's why it still exists. So instead of trying to eliminate it, this moment asks something different. It asks you to notice it. Notice the version of you that feels tension around money. The one that tightens when numbers rise. Or drops when they fall. The one that reacts before thinking. The one that feels old emotions in adult situations. You don't have to analyze it. Just notice. Notice how it speaks. How it warns. How it urges. How it hesitates. That voice isn't the enemy. It's the record of who you had to be. And for the first time, you're not being asked to override it. You're being asked to stand beside it. Because identity doesn't shift through force. It shifts through permission. The old self is built on protection. On vigilance. On familiarity. On repetition. It believes safety lives behind limits. It trusts what it knows. Even if what it knows is constricting. And the new self you've been reaching for isn't louder. It's quieter. It doesn't push. Doesn't rush. It doesn't prove. It doesn't need urgency to exist. The new identity doesn't feel dramatic at first. Feels subtle, almost neutral, sometimes even boring, because it isn't built on adrenaline. It's built on choice. The new self doesn't react to money the moment it appears. Doesn't attach meaning instantly. It doesn't confuse numbers with worth, or fluctuation with danger. Not because it's fearless, but because it's present. Presence is the difference. The old identity operates from memory, from prediction, from learned threat. The new identity operates from now. And you can feel the difference when you imagine it. The old self tightens first, then explains. The new self pauses first, then decides. The old self asks, what if this goes wrong? The new self asks, what is actually happening right now? The old self measures itself against ceilings. The new self notices them, and doesn't assume they're permanent. And this is where something important happens. Because the moment you can feel the difference between these two states, you realize something that no explanation could ever give you. You are not either one. You are the space where both exist. The authority you've been handing to fear. The authority you've been handing to conditioning. The authority you've been handing to old rules. It was never taken from you. It was given. And it can be reclaimed, not by fighting but by choosing where you stand. The shift isn't about becoming someone else. It's about updating who's in charge. The old identity doesn't need to disappear. It just doesn't need the steering wheel anymore. And you don't need to announce this shift. You don't need to declare it. You don't need to prove it with action immediately. Identity changes before behavior. Quietly, internally. Changes the moment you stop asking, how do I fix myself? And start asking, who am I choosing to be right now? That question doesn't demand an answer. Creates one. And if you sit with it long enough, you'll notice something else. The new identity doesn't feel like effort. Effort belongs to resistance. The new identity feels like alignment. Like less internal noise. Like less justification. Like less emotional charge. Money becomes information again. Not a verdict. Decisions slow down. Not because you're unsure, but because you're no longer being rushed by fear. This is the highest intensity point. Not because it's explosive, but because it's intimate. Because the moment you internalize this, the entire narrative shifts. You're no longer trying to escape the old self. You're no longer at war with your past. You're no longer proving anything. You're integrating. And integration is powerful. It's the difference between forcing change and allowing it. From here on, the question isn't, what should I do with money? It's, who am I being when money shows up? And that answer will keep evolving. Because identity isn't static. But this moment, this recognition, that you are not your conditioning, not your past reactions, not your inherited rules, that stays. This is where ownership lands. Not intellectually. Somatically. Emotionally. You feel it when it happens. A subtle settling. A sense of authorship. A quiet certainty that doesn't need reassurance. And from that place, change becomes possible. Not urgent, not forced, not performative. Possible. This is the peak, not because it resolves the story, but because it hands it back to you. And whatever comes next, whatever layers are still waiting, whatever systems remain to be interrupted, they will now meet a different identity than the one that arrived here. And that changes everything, even if nothing looks different yet, because the shift has already occurred. And you know it, even if you can't explain it. Especially if you can't explain it. There is a moment after intensity where the system needs something different. Not more insight. Not more emotion. Not more urgency. Needs steadiness. Because transformation that doesn't settle becomes noise. And noise doesn't last. So this final movement isn't about pushing you forward. It's about letting what has already happened inside you organize itself. You don't need to do anything right now. That's important. Nothing you've just experienced requires immediate action. No list. No plan. No behavioral overhaul. No promises to yourself that will quietly dissolve under pressure later. Those kinds of endings feel productive, but they erode trust. This one is different. Because the most meaningful change doesn't announce itself with effort. Integrates. Integration is what happens when insight stops feeling like information and starts feeling like orientation. You now see money differently. Not conceptually but structurally. You understand that your behavior wasn't random, broken, or moral. It was adaptive, conditioned, protective. And that understanding changes the relationship. Not by force, by clarity. When something is clearly seen, it no longer needs to shout. That's what calm confidence feels like. Not excitement, not certainty, orientation. From this place, money stops being the central character. It becomes contextual again. Signal, tool, a variable, not a verdict on your worth, intelligence, or future. This doesn't mean patterns instantly disappear. It means they're no longer invisible. And visibility changes power dynamics. When a reaction arises now, hesitation, urgency, contraction, you won't need to argue with it. You'll recognize it. You'll feel the space between the signal and the response. That space is control. Not rigid control. Responsive control. The kind that doesn't require suppression. This is why integration matters more than motivation. Motivation spikes. Integration stabilizes. Motivation demands movement. Integration allows choice. And choice is the only place where lasting change can emerge. Which brings us to the only commitment that actually matters here. Not a behavioral commitment. An identity one. One shift. Not dramatic. Not heroic. Simple. The shift from reacting to noticing. That's it. You don't need to change how you earn, spend, save, or invest right now. You don't need to make better decisions immediately. You only need to notice who is deciding when money appears. Old identity or present awareness. Protection or choice. Familiar safety or actual safety. Every time you notice without judgment, the system updates slightly. Not because you forced it, but because systems adapt to new information. And you've introduced new information. The nervous system doesn't change because it's told to. It changes because it no longer needs to protect against the same threat. That takes time. And that's okay. Rushing integration recreates the same pressure that built the conditioning in the first place. So this ending doesn't ask you to become optimistic. It offers controlled optimism. The kind rooted in realism. You now understand that money behavior follows laws, not luck. That identity shapes income before effort ever does. That loss aversion, scarcity perception, and emotional regulation drive decisions more than logic ever could. That knowledge doesn't make you immune. Makes you oriented. And orientation is enough. From here, the work becomes quieter. Less about fixing. More about observing. Less about proving. More about aligning. You'll notice moments where the old system still reacts. And that won't mean you failed. It will mean you noticed sooner than before. That's progress. You'll notice moments where you pause instead of pushing. And that won't mean you're hesitating. It will mean you're choosing. That's control. And over time, without announcements, without grand declarations, your relationship with money will begin to feel less charged. Not because money changed. 'Cause you did. Not into someone new. Into someone present. This is the sense of completion this act offers. Not closure. Orientation. You've moved from confusion to clarity. From shame to structure. From reaction to recognition. From effort to integration. And that's enough to stand on. Now. Because this story doesn't end here. Stabilizes here. What comes next doesn't need to be revealed yet. It doesn't need to be promised. It only needs to be implied. There are deeper layers to these systems. More specific rules. More precise points of interruption. Each one deserves its own focus. But none of them matter until this foundation is solid. And now it is. So instead of asking what you'll do next, consider this final framing. Money was never the problem to solve. It was the language your system used to express safety, identity, and survival. Now that you understand the language, you don't need to react to it automatically. You can listen. And listening changes everything. Whatever comes next, whether it's a deeper dive into one rule, a a new lens on identity, or an exploration of how these systems can actually be rewired, you'll meet it differently than you would have before. Not as someone seeking answers, but as someone who understands the terrain. And that makes all future learning possible. 'Cause this wasn't the end. It was the orientation point. And everything beyond it goes deeper.